When the British invaded South Asia in 1757 and embarked upon the conquest of Bengal, they were able to rely upon the willingness of local actors, including the Seths of Calcutta, including the senior leaders of the Bengal state itself, such as Mir Jafar. Their willingness to cooperate with the British was something that marked out the weakness of these states in the face of a British assault. So the British were able to rely upon local intelligence, local capital, local manpower, and local resources in order to carry out their conquest of South Asia. This would not have been, of course, possible if South Asians had felt a national bond or a sense of nationhood comparable to what was felt by the European nations of the time, such as Britain itself or France or the Netherlands. So, taken together, what this meant was that South Asia ended up getting occupied by the British. And this occupation took place in spite of the underlying demographic resilience of the population, the fact that the disease environment in South Asia was not at all favorable to large-scale British colonization efforts, the fact that South Asian states had at their disposal tremendous resources in terms of craftsmanship and technical ability that could have been used in order to halt and maybe even reverse the British advance, and that the South Asian states were familiar, indeed in many cases quite adept at the use of gunpowder weapons on land. So when we think about the British conquest and dominion of South Asia, we are really faced with a severe indictment of the South Asian states of the 18th century. Their lack of vision, their inability to comprehend the nature of the challenge posed by European imperialism and colonialism, and the fact that even though the British conquest of South Asia was very slow moving, taking about a century to be completed, no South Asian successor state, with the possible exceptions of Ranjit Singh in the Punjab and Tipu Sultan in Mysore, appears to have grasped the need for at least some type of modernization effort in dealing with the emerging threat. So we really are confronted with a problem which then resolves itself with the British conquest of this region and the onset of British colonial rule. Now, the type of state that the British encountered in South Asia was something that I refer to as a continental bureaucratic empire. And these states were characterized by several key features. The first was that the state is considered the personal estate of the ruler. The second is that the military is the major player and, in many cases, the primary administrative instrument of the state. The third is that the state claims divine sanction for the rulers and their actions. The fourth are that the servants of the state, which are also the ruling class, are considered personal servants of the ruler. And the fifth is that there are no lawful means of opposing the ruler and no legitimate mechanism for transferring power from one ruler to the next. Now, the British Indian state introduced a number of changes in each of these respects, and taken together, they altered the way in which state power is configured in our part of the world. The first was that the British, through a number of settlements, introduced the concept of private property as distinct from public property. And these two distinctions are extremely important because private property indicates that the person who owns that property has certain rights to it under law, and except under certain very specific circumstances cannot be deprived of that property. Then, in terms of public property is institutional property. Property that is held by the government or various institutions on behalf of the government, and that property is to be administered in accordance with certain laws and regulations. Both of these forms of property are very different from the arbitrary regime that existed prior to the British advent. In that regime, essentially your property rights depended upon the whim of the ruler. It didn't matter if the ruler was the great Mughal emperor or your local Raja. It was essentially the whim of that individual that determined to what extent your property rights would be honored. This was something which the British largely brought to an end. And these two institutional forms of property created various types of institutions and helped those institutions manage their public affairs. So we think about the railways. The railways have large holdings of public land. We think about military lands and cantonments. This is another major form of public property. We also can think of various other public endowment schemes used to fund educational and other institutions. But the basic idea behind public property is that public property is property held by the government or various institutions, and it is supposed to serve the interests of the state or the interests of the public as the need may be. So these two types of property regimes coexisted in British India. The second major change was that the military was insulated from politics and a civilian supremacy was established. Now, this was a tremendous development because in South Asia, until the British advent, all the major states that existed were states that were ruled by their militaries. It doesn't matter whether we look at the Mauryan Empire or the kingdom of Ranjit Singh, you essentially have the military ruling states. And within the military, there are rival factions, and these factions can even fight each other and compete with each other for overall political power. In the event of a succession from one ruler to the next, the loyalty of the military, and in some cases, the actual fighting strength of the military has to be employed in order to determine a successor. So the military as a political force is something which the British eliminate from the South Asian equation, at least during their rule. And they do so through this policy of insulation. They also do so because they carry with them, due to their own historical experience in England, a tradition of civilian rule, and they consider that tradition of civilian rule to be normal. It is, of course, normal for them, but it is not normal for South Asians. That is grafted into the military culture of the British Indian Army, and a conscious effort is made, especially after 1858, to limit the contact that that army has with the civilian population. So the British professionalize the military, they end the practice of purchasing commissions, they turn it into more and more of a meritocracy, and they proceed to use the military in a relatively limited manner only when there is a serious risk to the continuity of their rule or a serious risk, as far as they calculate it, to the preservation of public order. So that separation of the military from the day-to-day civil administration and its subordination to colonial political leaders and civil servants is something that creates a civilian-led state machinery in South Asia. Then the state ceases to claim divine sanction for its actions, and a version of secularism is established in South Asia. This version of secularism is somewhat different from the secularism that comes to prevail back in England itself. The reason for this is that South Asia does possess large communities of people who feel communal antagonism towards each other. So there is no unified civil code that is enforced, but a unified penal code is articulated and ultimately enforced throughout British India.